Hi guys! Welcome to Beklaedt's YouTube channel. If you are new to the channel, please remember to subscribe so you never miss out on new video guides, tips and tricks and much more. My name is Iben, and in today's video I'll show you how I make my jacket Tang with lining. This jacket follows the same overall fit and design as my quilted Tang jacket. The main difference is that I've lined the jacket, which makes it suitable for thicker fabrics, like a coat wool or boucle. I've also made the pockets square and added a pocket flap, while the top part of the button-down closure is open. You can buy the pattern for this jacket on my website Beklaedt.com. Alright, let's get started. I'm using this plate in a wool blend I got from Selfmade. The fabric is a thick wool with boucle yarn, which gives it a pretty cozy feel. The fabric has a medium to heavy thickness, but it also has a soft touch and a good drape. I'm using a satin weave lining in acetate. It's important to stabilize the facings of the jacket. To do this, I use a medium-thick fusible interfacing. The interfacing is firm in both directions, but it still has a soft touch. This kind of woven interfacing is good for wool fabrics. We also need 2 smaller buttons for the pockets, as well as 4 bigger buttons for the button-down closure on the front of the jacket. And don't forget the matching thread. Start by cutting out the pattern pieces according to the cutting guide. Remember to iron on interfacing to the indicated pattern pieces. Find the middle front piece and the side front piece and place them on top of each other, right sides together, and pin them together by the princess seam. Stitch the pieces together using a 1 cm seam allowance. I want to top stitch this seam afterwards, but it's not something that you absolutely have to do if you don't like it. A good trick is to use double thread to get a more visible top stitch in this thick wool. Pull both threads through the machine at the same time and thread the needle with both threads like you normally would. Press the seam allowance towards the side piece. From the right side, top stitch 7 mm from the edge, which catches the seam allowance on the back side through the layers. If you don't want to top stitch, then I recommend splitting open the seam with your iron instead. Place the front yoke on top of the gathered front pieces, right sides together, and secure with pins. Stitch the pieces together using a 1 cm seam allowance. Like before, I finish by top stitching the seam allowance in place 7 mm from the edge. Press the seam allowance towards the neckline and stitch from the right side. The back pieces are gathered the same way. Place the 2 back pieces on top of the middle back piece, right sides together, and pin the pieces together by the princess seam. Stitch the pieces together using a 1 cm seam allowance. Finish by top stitching the seam allowance in place from the right side. Press the seam allowance towards the side pieces and make a top stitch 7 mm from the edge. Just like before, I finish by sewing the back yoke to the lower back pieces. If you're working with a plait like me, you might need to adjust the pattern pieces along the way to get an even look. Place the back yoke on top of the lower back pieces, right sides together, and secure with pins. Stitch the pieces together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Again, I finish by top stitching the seam allowance in place. Press the seam allowance towards the neckline and make a stitch 7 mm from the edge. Place the back of the jacket on top of the two fronts and stitch the pieces together at the shoulder seams with a 1 cm seam allowance. Finish by pressing the seam allowance open with your iron. Find the two pockets and pocket flaps in both the outer fabric and lining. Place the lining on top of the outer fabric, right sides together, and stitch the pieces together using a 1 cm seam allowance. Make sure to leave 5 cm in the middle of either of the sides. Trim away all 4 corners as close to the stitching as possible. Use the hole to turn the pieces around so the right side is facing up. You can use the beak of the scissor to press the corners. Close off the hole with pins. Do the exact same for the pocket flap. Finish by pressing the pocket pieces with your iron to get sharp edges and crisp corners. While the outer fabric is facing up, I top stitch all around the pocket flap and pocket. I use my presser foot as my seam guide. I mark the placement of the buttonhole on the pocket flap by finding the middle along the long edge. The size of the buttonhole depends on the size of your button. My button is 22 mm wide. I place a pin to mark the starting point of the buttonhole approximately 5 mm in on the flap. Then I place the button on top to be able to place a second pin, which marks the end of the buttonhole. I stitched the buttonhole with double thread to get a thicker edge. The pockets should be placed on the front of the jacket so the bottom of the pocket is 5 cm away from the hemline of the jacket. The center line of the pocket is placed directly on top of the princess seam. The pocket flap is placed so the top edge of the flap is exactly 2 cm above the top edge of the pocket. The center line of the flap should also be placed on top of the princess seam. I start by stitching the pocket to the jacket front. I stitch along the outer edge of the pocket approximately 1 to 2 mm from the edge, which sets the pockets in place. Afterwards, I stitched the pocket flap in place along the top edge 1 to 2 mm from the edge. I finish by making a second stitch on the pocket flap, on top of the stitching we did when we turned the flap around. Find the 2 sleeves and place them in each armhole, right sides together. Remember to place the sleeves correctly in relation to the front and back. I start by matching the shoulder marking on the sleeve with the shoulder seam on the jacket. Then I distribute the rest of the sleeve cap in the armhole on either side. Stitch the sleeves in place using a 1 cm seam allowance. I find it easier if the sleeve is facing the sewing machine while the jacket is facing up. Remember to keep the shoulder seam open when you stitch over it. Turn the jacket around so the right sides are facing each other. Press the seam allowance from the armhole towards the body and place pins along the side seam of the body and sleeve. Stitch the side seam in one continuous stitch with a 1 cm seam allowance. Find the 2 colors. As you can see, I have only interfaced one color, which is going to be my undercolor, that is, the side of the collar that faces downwards. Place the 2 colors on top of each other, right sides together, and secure with pins along the outer edge. Stitch the colors together along the outer edge with a 1 cm seam allowance. Trim away the corners as close to the stitching as possible. This is necessary to do in order to get a crisp corner. Turn the pieces around so the right side is facing up and use the beak of the scissors to press the corners into place. When you're happy, you need to press the collar with your iron to get a crisp edge. While the upper collar is facing up, a top stitch along the edge 7 mm from the edge. The collar is placed at the neckline by matching the center back of the jacket with the center back of the collar. Remember to place the undercollar so it faces downwards towards the jacket. Secure the collar at the neckline with pins and use the marking on the front yoke, which shows you where you should place the outer edge of the collar. Stitch the collar in place by making a stitch 5 mm from the edge. If you want to add a neck loop to the jacket, now is the time to do so. Find the two front facings and the neck facing. Place the neck facing on top of the front facing, right sides together, and stitch the shoulder seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. Split open the shoulder seam with your iron. Find the back hem piece and the front hem pieces. Place the two front hem pieces on top of the back hem piece, right sides together, and pin the pieces together by the side seam. Find the front facing and place the bottom side next to the front hem piece, right sides together. Make sure to leave the top part of this seam open. We will use it to secure the lining afterwards. Place a pin halfway to mark the end of the seam. Stitch the pieces together. Remember to leave the top part of the seam on the front facing open. Place the facing on top of the jacket, right sides together. Fold the collar under the facing. Place pins all along the neckline and jacket opening. It's often the case that the front part of the jacket has become longer than the facing, due to the fact that we only interfaced the facing. You can choose to either trim the button edge of the jacket so it fits perfectly with the facing, or you can, like I'm showing you here, distribute the excess fabric evenly along the facing, whereby the difference disappears. Continue adding pins along the hem pieces and bottom of the jacket. Make sure to match the side seams with each other. Stitch the facing in place all around the jacket with a 1 cm seam allowance. Trim away all the sharp corners to get a crisp corner. Snip into the seam allowance along the neckline so the fabric lays neatly when the layers are turned around. Mark the placement of the breaking point on the front yoke and snip into the seam allowance at this point. If you don't want to shape a lapel collar like me, you can skip this step. We are going to understitch the seam allowance in place to help shape the collar on the top part of the button-down closure. You should press the seam allowance towards the facing below the breaking point, while you need to press the seam allowance towards the jacket above this point. From the right side, we are going to make an understitch that catches the seam allowance on either side. I start as far up as I can get. I remember to press the seam allowance towards the jacket, which is also the side I'm starting on. When I reach the breaking point, I press the seam allowance towards the facing and continue stitching a couple of millimeters from the edge, but now I'm on the side of the facing. Continue this understitch as far down as you can get. Along the bottom edge of the jacket, I understitch the seam allowance to the hem pieces. Find the two hem pieces for the sleeves. Fold them in half, right sides together, and stitch the side seams together. Place the hem pieces around the sleeve, right sides together, and match the side seams with each other. Remember to split open the seams. Stitch the hem in place to the sleeve with a 1 cm seam allowance. Press the seam allowance towards the hem piece and understitch the seam allowance in place a couple of millimeters from the edge. Now it's time to finish the lining. Find the back lining, fold it right sides together and place a pin according to the marking on the pattern piece. Stitch directly down for 2 cm to shape the back pleat. Fold the two front lining pieces in half, right sides together, so the two markings align. Make the same straight stitch 2 cm in to shape the front pleat. Place the front pieces on top of the back piece, right sides together. And stitch the pieces together by the shoulder seam. Split open the seam with your iron. Find the sleeves and pin each sleeve to each armhole, right sides together. I've placed a pin to mark the front of the sleeve, so don't mix up the two sleeves. Stitch the sleeve to the armhole using a 1 cm seam allowance. Stitch the side seam of the lining as one continuous stitch. Press the seam allowance from the armhole towards the body. It's very important that you remember to leave open about 20 cm along the right sleeve, which we are going to use to turn the jacket through. Find the jacket and place it on the table so the right side is facing up. Pin the lining to the inner edge of the front facing. I start by matching the center back of the lining with the center back of the neck facing. Afterwards, I match the shoulder seams with each other. Use the marking on the front facing to place the lining correctly. The bottom edge of the lining is pinned to the bottom hem piece on the front of the jacket. This means you should skip the corner for now. Continue placing pins along the bottom edge, while of course matching the side seams with each other. All seams should be split open. I start by stitching the lining to the bottom corner of the hem piece and finish by the other corner. After this, I make a little fold from the surplus lining, which is wedged in between the front facing and hem piece. Then I continue up along the front facing, along the neckline, and finish by the other front facing, where I have already pressed the lining in place between the facing and hem piece. Now we can pull the jacket through the hole in the sleeve so the right side of the jacket faces out and the lining lays inside. Press the lining into the sleeve. I press my right hand through the opening in the sleeve on the right sleeve, whereby my hand is laying between the lining and the jacket. With my left hand, I fold the lining down so the right side of the lining lays next to the right side of the jacket. I make sure that the lining is not twisted around the sleeve of the jacket, and I also make sure to match the side seams with each other. With a firm grip, I pull both layers back through the hole in the sleeve to be able to attach pins around the edge. Stitch the lining to the sleeve with a 1 cm seam allowance all the way around. Pull the sleeve back into place. Now we need to do the same thing on the other side. This time I press my left hand through the hole in the sleeve so I can get a hold of both layers on the left sleeve. Again, I hold on to both layers while I pull the fabric back through the hole in the right sleeve. Like before, I attached the lining to the sleeve with pins and stitched it in place. Alright, that's the lining done. That wasn't too bad, right? I finish by making a couple of stitches by hand that secures the side seam from the hem piece to the side seam of the jacket on the inside. This helps the hem piece to stay in place, and you cannot see the stitches from the right side. To keep the collar in its correct position, I top stitch the facing to the jacket. I start at the breaking point on one side, stitch over the neckline and finish by the other breaking point. Make sure to press the collar away from the sewing machine. Stitch approximately 7 mm from the edge. Now we need to sew in the buttons. I use 4 big buttons that are 32 mm wide. In order to get the center of the button to lay at the center fold line, which is 2 cm away from the edge, I place a vertical pin 1.5 cm away from the edge. This pin marks the beginning of the buttonhole. Then I place a pin 3.5 cm further in on the jacket, which marks the length of the buttonhole. Lastly, I place a horizontal pin to mark the placement of the button. The next buttonhole is placed with a vertical distance of 11 cm from the previous buttonhole. If your buttons have other dimensions than mine, you might need other measurements than me. I make the buttonholes using double thread. Carefully cut open the buttonhole. I sew in the button on the left side of the jacket by hand. I always make a couple of stitches to check the position of the button before securing it. The remaining buttons are sewn in the same way. Lastly, we need to attach a button to the pocket. Now we only need to close off the hole in the lining in the sleeve. Fold the 2 raw edges 1 cm towards the wrong side and close the hole with pins. You can either close off the hole by hand or do it on the machine like me by stitching a couple of millimeters from the edge. Great! The jacket is done and ready to be used all winter. I hope you liked watching this video. Maybe you've learned that attaching lining isn't too difficult. If you liked this video, please give it a like. You're also welcome to share it with your friends. Please remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you never miss out on new video guides, tips and tricks, and much more. Bye!